Hi, I'm Shana Meyerson with the Yoga of War podcast, here today with leading Israel scholar Einat Wilf. If you appreciate and find value in these important discussions, please consider supporting the show so I can continue to bring you such amazing and esteemed guests. Details are pinned in the comments below. Let me start by saying the Jewish state is here to stay. And for the anti-Zionists who argue that the Jewish people don't deserve a state because they were outnumbered by Arabs in the Jewish ancestral homeland, let me put this into perspective. In the United States, we have 1.2 million Native Americans who live on reservations. That's 1/3 of 1% of our population. They have been given 87,500 square miles of sovereign land. Israel has a population of 9.8 million, 7.2 million of which are Jewish. Their country is 8,019 square miles. So the Jewish Israeli population is 6 times that of the Native Americans, and the Native American land is 11 times bigger than Israel. So if you want to talk about indigenous rights, there's no way to morally separate the Jews from the land of Israel. The fundamental error of the anti-Zionist argument is analogizing the Jews of Israel to the British colonizers instead of the Native Americans. In fact, the Jews were in Israel for centuries before Christianity or Islam was even born. That being said, all things being equal, I would actually support a one Jewish state solution because the Jewish state is the only state in the Middle East where everyone of every religion, gender, or nationality enjoys free and equal rights. And I might add, the only nation in the entire Middle East where Jews have rights at all. However, all things are far from equal. And the question of a so-called solution to this age-old conflict is far from simple. Today, Einat and I will discuss the opportunities and challenges of a 1, 2, and even 3-state solution. Dr. Einat Wilf is a leading thinker on Israel, Zionism, foreign policy, and education. Born and raised in Israel, she has been a member of the Knesset, served as an intelligence officer in the Israel Defense Forces, was foreign policy advisor to Vice Prime Minister Shimon Peres, and a strategic consultant with McKinsey and Company. Dr. Wilf has a BA from Harvard, an MBA from INSEAD in France, a PhD in political science from the University of Cambridge, and was the Goldman Visiting Professor at Georgetown University. Dr. Wilf is the author of 7 books that explore key issues in Israeli society, including We Should All Be Zionists and The War of Return: How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream has Obstructed the Path to Peace, co-authored with Adi Schwartz. Einat, thank you so much for joining me today. This is such a tremendous honor.
My pleasure.
To set the stage for today's discussion, can we start by defining Zionism? It's so ironic to me how many people in this world identify as anti-Zionist. But if you ask them what Zionism is, like, honestly, they really could only say Jew. Can you define Zionism for us?
Sure. Zionism is the political movement for the liberation, self-determination of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland. Each part of it is important. It's a political movement in the sense, sometimes people like to say Zionism is 3,000 years old. So it's true that the connection between the people of Israel and the land of Israel is 3,000 and more years old. a long historical, cultural, religious, ritual, uninterrupted connection. In fact, as a people, the Jewish people have only ever been connected to one land. But when people say Zionism is a 3,000-year-old movement, they make a ahistorical argument, because then why would a state of Israel emerge in the 20th century, not in the 15th, not in the 10th? What happened then? And that's why the other parts are important. It's a movement for liberation and self-determination. It is a movement that emerged out of Enlightenment and other worldviews that spoke about the liberation of people, the right of peoples to live free of empire, the right of peoples to have self-determination, to be masters of their own fate, rather than to be the mercy of others. So Zionism is born out of the universal principle of self-determination for peoples. It is about the Jews being a people. Sometimes people try to deny Zionism by claiming that Jews are only members of a faith, which is actually a 19th century European construct. It's not the way Jews think about themselves. There's a great quote by Dara Horn, who wrote the great book, People Love Dead Jews. She says, when people try to fit Jews into a box, are you a nation? Are you ethnicity? Are you a race? And she says, we predate your boxes. We have one word for us, and it's just two letters, one syllable, Am. So we are Am Yisrael, we are the people of Israel. So the idea of self-determination for the people and in their ancestral homeland. So it's in the one and only land where they ever made sense collectively. Individually, Jews could live in many places. Collectively, they only make sense in one. So that's Zionism, the political movement for liberation and self-determination of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland.
Sure. And ironically, when we talk about Am Yisrael the way that you do on being a nation, this isn't just our own definition. I hate to say it because of the inherent irony, but the Nazis employed the same definition. In fact, they even extended it. If you had one grandparent who was born into Judaism, you are a Jew. And so to try to decouple Judaism from the religion of Judaism, or I should say to not to couple it, is an absolute fallacy. So
I will just say one thing, so because I can't leave it as is.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. What the Nazis did by racializing the Jewish identity was dangerous and sinister. It had nothing to do with the way Jews view themselves. In general, today, with the idea of whiteness, no one has ever racialized Jews to their benefit. The Jews have their own conception of who they are. Am Yisrael is best understood as a tribe, but a joinable tribe, a tribe that people can join. All the other definitions that people put on us, from race to religion, were outside imposed and typically not to our own benefit.
Thank you for that clarification. My only point was the fact that Jews transcend religion. But thank you so much. So Einat, so we have this political movement to reestablish a sovereign land in our ancestral homeland, and now we have it. So why do we still need Zionism?
I wrote a while ago a big piece on anti-Zionism and anti-feminism, and each in its own context, how the backlash to the liberation of women and to the liberation of Jews reflects the inability of traditional power structures that were embedded into civilizations to let go of power. And at the end of that essay, I say that the Zionist revolution, the feminist revolution, all these revolutions end when non-Jews, men, look at the idea of Jews with power, women with power, whatever group it is, with power as an absolute non-issue. So the fact remains, and you can see it in the continuing obsession with the Jewish state and with Zionism, the fact remains that the idea of Jews being sovereign, masters of their own fate, self-determined, not at the mercy of others, still grates on some kind of deep civilizational consciousnesses, if you could say, about what the proper role of the Jew is. So Zionism actually ends its mission not by the creation of a state, that is an important milestone, but when the rest of the world essentially becomes Zionist, in the sense that the rest of the world looks upon the idea of Jews who are self-determined, powerful, as an absolute non-issue.
100%. And also since 10/7, for those of us in the diaspora, the importance of having a Jewish state, an actual Jewish state, has hit home so, it's landed so clearly. I have to say that as a diaspora Jew, I always knew that having an Israeli state was important, a Jewish state. I always grew up as a Zionist, but I never understood until 14 months ago the why. And now I understand not just, yes, I want a Jewish state, but that in the streets of LA, when I have people rioting outside the Israeli consulate, which is just a few blocks away from me, it really hits home that if I don't make Aliyah now, there are no guarantees that I won't literally have to next week or next year or next decade. We don't know where the world is heading, and now Zionism takes on a whole new meaning.
Certainly.
Yeah, so let me ask you a question about Zionism. And I want to get into a lot of different permutations of multi-state solutions. But I'm just going to say two-state because it's the solution that most people refer to. Einat, do you see any inherent conflict between the concept of Zionism and the two-state solution and what you would term Palestinianism and the two-state solution? Where's the difference?
So to the first, there's no conflict, and to the second, there very much is a conflict, and I'll explain. The idea of Jewish self-determination, by definition, is not against self-determination of anyone else. So, as I said, Zionism emerges against the background of the disappearance of empires and the rise of the idea of states, of people governing themselves by themselves rather than by imperial control. And various peoples rise up as the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, the Ottoman empires. As these empires collapse, ultimately the British, the French, they rise up to claim their right to self-determination. So the Jewish right to self-determination can very much live next to the Arab right to self-determination, the Kurdish right to self-determination, the Armenian, the Turkish, all of the various peoples of the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, the Kurds, the Armenians, the Arabs, the Jews, the idea that all of them have the right to self-determination once the Ottoman Empire is gone, that is not at the expense of others. You can have territorial disputes, but fundamentally the right to self-determination for Jews is not exclusive of others. What I have come to term Palestinianism is something different. Palestinianism is what I've come to term as the ideology and identity that is devoted to the non-existence of Jewish sovereignty. So by definition, Palestinianism is incompatible with the existence of two states if one of them is Jewish. And I explained that if you look at the last century, going back to the original two-state solution, the one that created Transjordan from the areas that were supposed to be initially for Jewish self-determination, the Jews have always said yes to any two-state solution, provided that one of the two is the Jewish state. So not only in theory, but also in action, we have always shown that the idea of Jewish self-determination is not against Arab self-determination, but we do want one state that is for us. But the Arabs, and especially the Arabs that with time became known as Palestinians or Palestinianists, they have come to define their identity increasingly for the last century, not just as merely Arabs coming from Hebron or Shechem or anything of the sort. They have come to define themselves as Palestinians, or I call it Palestinianists, people whose very identity and ideology is about opposing primarily the non-existence of a Jewish state. So the Arabs, whenever they were presented with the possibility of having a two-state, if one of the two were the Jewish state, they opposed it. So we can see that Zionism in action throughout history is not incompatible with Arab self-determination, even Palestinian self-determination, if it were ever about positive self-determination. This is why Jewish Zionist leaders have repeatedly offered two states, agreed to two states, but Palestinianism is inherently incompatible with a two-state solution if one of the states is Jewish. That's hence from the river to the sea, and that's why they repeatedly reject any such possibility.
Exactly. So what I'd love to do is, of course, I'm sure everyone has seen the maps that we're about to put up. I'm going to put up a map on screen first, which everyone on Earth has seen, and which purport to demonstrate the disappearance of Arab land in Israel. Let me just pull that up, and then Einat is going to show some other maps. But everybody, I assume, has seen these maps about quote unquote disappearing Palestine. Einat, I'm sure you've seen these so many times that you could draw them in your sleep. Can you talk about these maps, the fallacy of the maps from left to right?
Sure. So will you allow me to pull up my maps, and then and that would actually allow us to do it. So I am sharing maps from, I'll go a little bit up. This is an essay that appeared already in 2015 by my colleague, Dr. Shana Moore, one of my favorite thinkers with whom I like to think and write. It's called The Mendacious Maps of Palestinian Loss. You will get no better explanation for why each of these maps here actually absolutely makes no sense. The short answer is it's comparing oranges and apples, and I'll explain in a minute. But what Shani then did very well is he created new maps, the correct ones. Because one starts with like combining privately owned land with non-owned land. Then one looks at a political proposal, partition, which the Arabs rejected. Then it looks at like the Egyptian and Jordanian occupation. So it like just makes a whole mess of things. So Shani is a person who very much likes things to be orderly and standardized. So he says, okay, we'll actually, rather than the mess that they made with those maps, we'll standardize them to look at Arab, and especially what's called Arab-Palestinian control of territory. And essentially it looks like this: nothing, nothing, then some more nothing, then finally something, and then something. That's it, a little more something. That's it. That's the story. And again, I highly recommend going and looking for this essay. It's called The Mendacious Maps of Palestinian Loss. But that's the correct one. And why it's important to understand that this is the correct one, because actually, especially as we look at this moment, when we focus on Gaza, as we can see from this picture, came under Palestinian Arab political control partially for the first time in 95 and fully after the Israeli disengagement in 2005. Did the Arab Palestinians say, finally, look, finally, we have territory that we control? We're going to turn this. I mean, look, it sits on the shores of the Mediterranean with beautiful sandy beaches, with sand coming from the Egyptian delta. Gaza sits at the crossroads of two ancient trade routes. We are going to turn this into the Dubai of the Levant. It's going to be the pearl of the Mediterranean. Is that what they say? No. True to their century-long Palestinianist ethos of primarily focusing on trying to prevent and then to undo the existence of a sovereign Jewish state, they say, fabulous. We're going to use this territory that we now finally control in order to use it as literally a launch pad in order to try to bring an end to Jewish sovereignty between the river and the sea. So that's why these maps are so important, because they are the correct ones that show that a people who were so focused on ensuring that the Jews had nothing kept on having nothing because they kept on waging wars, because it was more important for them that the Jews have nothing than that they have something. And that even when they finally had something, they immediately turned to use it for the purpose of ensuring that the Jews have nothing. And that's the story.
And I wish that I had the forethought to pull up a map of the Middle East so people can understand that on this map, where Israel is like the whole story, Israel is so minuscule. It's 1/500th the size of the Arab world. And let me add that Jordan to the east, which is massive compared to Israel, is a Palestinian state, if you want to use like the word Palestinian. And I know you hate that word. I'm only using it because Arab is too pan-Arab, and is Israeli Arab, these people aren't Israeli. So for lack of a other categorization, it's easier for me to call them Palestinians. Also, the Lebanese, mostly Palestinians. You have to understand that Palestinians already have two de facto states, not to mention the fact that there has never been a sovereign Arab country on this land that is now called Israel. So if you look at this map and go, yeah, but the green is so small. It's small compared to what she's saying, which was nothing.
So let me look. So let me use this map, if I may.
Yes.
This is one of my favorites, these three maps. What you see here in two tones, the green and the kind of the orange and the blue, that's the partition map, right? People will recognize it quite easily. And then here in the blue and light blue are the incidents of malaria in the early 20th century. So what you can see, it's almost one-to-one basically. And then in the middle, you actually have a map of private ownership. So what you see is that the Jews essentially purchased the malaria-infested land, typically from absentee landlords, and made it good agricultural, valuable land through the eradication of malaria, through science, through education. And those are privately held Arab lands. But you see that like there's no disproportion here. So again, and no one owns, there's no state. It's still under Ottoman control and then under interim British tutelage with the purpose of enabling the Jews to achieve sovereignty. So what you see here, amazingly, is that after the Arabs have spent the 20s, the 30s, the 40s violently trying to prevent Jewish immigration to the land. Sometimes Arabs say, well, there weren't a lot of Jews. And I'm like, yeah, you kind of made sure of that. It's not, you first make sure that you violently ensure that the Jews cannot come because the Jews were supposed to have their state in the 1930s. That's a key point that people often ignore and gloss over. As part of the movement for self-determination, with the disappearance of empires, the Jews, like the other peoples of the Ottoman Empire, the Arabs, the Kurds, the Armenians, the Turks, were supposed to have their own state. And the British and the French were just awarded a kind of interim tutelage. But it was understood that ultimately the peoples of the empire will govern themselves by themselves. You mentioned proportions when you opened the call. If the Jews had received their fair share of the land of the Ottoman Empire based on their share of the population of the Ottoman Empire, Israel would have been multiple times the size that it is today. But, and other peoples were going to get their states too. So I always like to remind people that there was supposed to be a Kurdish state and an Armenian state and a small Turkish state. But then the Turks did what they did to the Kurds and the Armenians, and there was no Kurdish state till the present. And the Armenian state ultimately was established somewhere else, not in the Armenian homeland. The Arabs tried to do the same for the Jews with less success, but with some success. They were successful in preventing the Jewish state from emerging in the 1930s, as it should have, as it was ready, through violence and ultimately through forcing Britain to betray the terms that it unanimously received from the League of Nations to help the Jews achieve sovereignty in the land. So the Arabs were largely responsible for the Jews not having a state in the 30s, which meant that the scale of the Holocaust was therefore much greater as a result, because hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jews could have come to the Jewish state if it existed in the 1930s. And we might have only seen an ethnic cleansing of Jews from Europe rather than a genocide, an actual one. And how do I know? Because in the 1950s, when the Arab world ethnically cleansed the Jews from Morocco to Afghanistan, the difference that this time it was only an ethnic cleansing of Jews rather than a genocide is that they had the state of Israel. So the Arabs actually had a choice. Despite everything they did, the Jews were ultimately able to kind of really, through persistence, to establish and to get approval for a small state on the lands they reclaimed from malaria, plus the Negev desert. So malaria and desert. And even that was too much for the Arabs. And that's really important to mention, because sometimes people say, what choice do the Arabs have? What choice do the Palestinians have? And I'm like, the same choice they had for the last century, to build for themselves rather than to destroy for the Jews, and to just live next to the Jewish state rather than constantly try to ensure that it doesn't exist. So these are the maps that, in my view, tell the real story of the conflict.
Okay, so the questions I'm asking you, I know, are really so that you could explain in ways that, people just don't necessarily need to hear from me. So I know the answer to a lot of these questions, but what people are going to say, they're going to be like, well, obviously, how could you say there is no Palestine? This map that you're using says Palestine. What?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Palestine. Explain. Because Golda Meir has this very famous video that's been circulating about, like, my birth certificate says Palestine. I am a Palestinian. Can you explain?
Sure, one of my favorite things to discuss. Also, if you'd like, I discuss a lot about how words were deformed, hijacked, stripped of meaning, and then inserted with new meanings, all in order to serve in the battle against the Jewish state and Jewish sovereignty. It's a piece that appeared in Sapir called the Palestine Propaganda Complex, and it looks at it in detail. But the word Palestine, upon which all rests. So the at the end of the World War I, there's all these beautiful ideas that, people will govern themselves free from empire. The League of Nations is established, among other things, to carry out this beautiful ideal of human self-governance instead of empires based on nations. And the Ottoman Empire is broken down, and rather than immediately allow the Arabs, the Turks, the Armenians, the Kurds, the Jews to establish self-determination, the victorious powers, the French and the British, are given an interim tutelage to help the people achieve sovereignty, but it is understood that it is interim, and at the end of the day, the people will govern themselves by themselves. Now, a series of mandates, they're called mandates, are established for the Arabs. Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon all become states in the 30s. And there's a mandate for the Jews. And the mandate for the Jews is called the Mandate for Palestine, and it says the following. He says, recognizing the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine. Wow. What does it mean? The historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine? How can that be? Because 100 years ago, before the campaign of erasure was underway, everyone knew, that's why it is a unanimous decision of the League of Nations, everyone knew that Palestine was merely the Roman, colonial, Christian, European name given to the geography associated with the Jewish kingdoms, the Holy Land. For decades, for centuries, for millennia, if you went around Europe and you said Palestine or Palestina, everyone knew it as a synonym for the Holy Land where the Jewish kingdoms once stood, right? It was named so because Emperor Adrian, trying to multiple times put down the revolts of the pesky Jews, decided to sever the connection between the Judeans and Judea by renaming Judea Provincia Palestina. And so it became the Roman Christian European colonial name. So the mandate for Palestine is understood to be the mandate for the establishment of a Jewish state. So in real time, 100 years ago, the connotation of the word Palestine was clearly Jewish. Throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s, the people are basically called Jews and Arabs. No one is really called a Palestinian. And then when the Jews finally throw the yoke of empire, right? I'd like to say that Zionism is such a decolonial movement that it had to wait out the Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire and the Russian, and it had to wait out so many empires until the Jews could finally govern themselves. So when the Jews finally have their independence, right, in that little area reclaimed from Illyrian desert in their ancestral homeland, they do what every self-respecting indigenous people did when they finally governed themselves in their homeland, which is throw off the colonial name, which was Palestine, and call themselves by their indigenous name, Israel. Now, what happens is that you have a state of Israel, and the Arabs who have just waged war, a stupid, terrible, brutal war, for this singular purpose of trying to prevent the Jewish state from emerging, they fail. But they don't view their failure as finished. It's merely a temporary setback. One day they will still undo the Jewish state. So now the Arabs of that area, some of whom became refugees as a result of a war which they really did not have to wage. They could have said yes and live in their own state with no one becoming a refugee. But again, they chose to go to war against Jewish self-determination in any part of the land. They failed to achieve it. Some became refugees. So now those Arabs begin to coalesce against around the singular goal of no Jewish state. And the name Palestine is left dangling. and they are now called Palestine refugees. And they begin to be called Palestinians. And a campaign begins to create the idea of Palestine as some mythical land that was exclusively Arab. And there you reach the bizarre world today where we say Palestine for Palestinians. And this phrase, which sounds very simple, is actually the result of a century-long campaign of erasure, whereby the connotation of Palestine as the colonial name for the Jewish homeland is replaced with the notion of an exclusive Arab land that's kind of predated the existence of some colonial entity called Israel. So pretty much everything in all of that is upside down. So when the plan of partition says Palestine, again, that's because this was the mandate for Palestine, which was based on the recognizing the historical connection of the Jewish people with the land. And even one more thing, the language of the mandate for Palestine, for the Jews to achieve sovereignty, had language which no other mandate for Arab states had. It said that the historical connection of the Jews with the land is the grounds for reconstituting their homeland, meaning that it was unanimously known and acknowledged that in the Jews building a new modern sovereign state in the land of Israel, they were merely reconstituting an ancient sovereignty.
That explains it. Okay. Let me go back to some other maps really quickly, and then we'll get back into a plain old discussion so people who are just listening on a podcast can actually understand what we're talking about. Now I want to talk about the actual partition. The plan, as you mentioned, was initially a much larger area than what is now the state of Israel. And again, let me emphasize to people that this makes Israel look like a very, very large portion because the map is just basically highlighting Israel. Let me just say one more time, this is 1/500th of the size of the Arab Middle East, okay? But we're just zooming in, basically these maps of Israel plus modern day Jordan. Let's get into these maps.
Sure. Any question? Do you want me to address anything specifically?
If you could just talk about from the left, from the British mandate,
Sure.
all the way
Okay.
to what it is today, which we've already pretty much touched upon, so that people can
Okay.
that the
Okay.
land actually disappeared from the Jews, not from the Arabs.
Yes. So again, to recap, at the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapses. The President Wilson, the Americans want to put an end to the era of colonialism, and they create the principle, which is already bubbling up, the principle of self-determination for peoples. This is the basis by which the map of Europe gets redrawn once the Russian and the Austro-Hungarian and other empires are gone. The victorious British and French don't like this idea, so essentially the mandate system is a kind of compromise whereby the principle of self-determination for Arabs, Jews, Turks, Armenians, Kurds will be realized, but there will be an interim tutelage period of the French and the British. The Arab self-determination is to be exercised in what later becomes Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. Initially, the mandate for the Jews, which is the mandate for Palestine, again, before the word was distorted, the mandate for the Jews is initially planned to include both sides of the Jordan River, so what's called Transjordan, what is today Jordan, and Israel, and the territories. But no need to go into details, but as a result of various geopolitical messes and British and French messes, the Jews are essentially semi-threatened that their self-determination, if they want to secure it, depends on the entire Transjordan being taken away from them. And this creates essentially Transjordan. And the way you know that Palestine meant Jewish is that from that moment on, when Transjordan is created and taken out of the mandate for Palestine, this is also when Jewish settlement in Transjordan becomes forbidden. So when something is taken out of the mandate for Palestine, that is when it is forbidden for Jews. This is, by the way, why you still have lands that belong to the Jewish National Fund in Jordan, because this process happened after World War I, but Jews started purchasing land already in the second half of the 19th century. So what is left is merely west of the Jordan River. It's about 20%, about a fifth of the original territory. And again, all of it is supposed to be for a Jewish state with secure religious and civil rights for the non-Jewish inhabitants. And the Arabs, essentially, the Arabs who are west of the Jordan River, basically go to a war that continues to the present day with the declared purpose of, I quote here, a description of the conflict from a British address to Parliament in February 47 that basically says that the top goal of the Arabs in the land is not to build their own state, but rather to resist at the last the establishment of Jewish state in any part of the land. So as a result, they are successfully able to prevent the emergence of a Jewish state in the 30s, as it should have. As a result, there are far fewer Jews in the 40s. You know, sometimes Arabs and Palestinianists like to present themselves as secondary victims of the Holocaust, kind of the notion that Israel came into being because of the Holocaust, thanks to it, rather than as a result of the idea of self-determination in their ancestral homeland in the wake of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. But the truth is the opposite, actually. The Arabs' success in the 30s in closing the gates of the embryonic Jewish state to Jewish immigration at the most dire time for the Jewish people meant that after World War II, there was a moment when it appeared that there will be no Jewish state because there were no Jews. So the Arabs were almost nearly as successful in preventing a Jewish state as the Turks have been in preventing, in the territory they wanted, a Kurdish and an Armenian state. I always remind people that Zionism was far from destined to succeed. Today, we just view it as a straight line. You know, Herzl wrote a book and then there's a state. At any moment, it was not inevitable. In fact, in any moment, it was against all odds. But the Jews really are able to pick themselves up and through perseverance and really remarkable genius diplomacy are able to get the partition proposal, which again takes away half of the 20% that was supposed to be theirs. And again, reminding that had Jews received their fair share of the lands of the Ottoman Empire, it would have looked like the original map. But even though the land allocated to the Jews is the land that they, where they eradicated malaria and the Negev desert, even though that's all they're being offered, so half of 20%, they go dancing hora when the partition proposal is passed in the UN General Assembly, because what the Jews cared about, and we go back to the beginning of our conversation, is sovereignty, self-determination, this map literally shows you again and again the Jewish self-determination is not at the expense of Arab self-determination, but it is at the expense of obsessive anti-Jewish ideology. Yes. So the Jews were again and again, and to the present day, again and again, willing to live side by side with Arab self-determination as long as there is somewhere in our land Jewish self-determination.
Sure. And to this day, right, where we still see, though people don't want to see it, everyone wants to blame the Jews, who have offered 5 to 7 times land for peace offers that basically are everything the Palestinians claim to want. But there's this premise of the three no's: no Jewish state, no peace, no negotiations. And people have to understand that this is the basis of the war today. We have the IDF, which are the Israeli Defense Forces. All the wars that have been fought have been defensive wars, including the one that Einat has referred to, which occurred 5 hours after the establishment of the state of Israel, to try to eradicate the Jewish state before it even had a chance to exist. This is the core of the issue. So let us move on, unless there's anything else you'd like to add, Einat, about these maps.
No?
Okay, cool. Okay, so now that we have like this understanding of the history of the Jewish population and the partition, we have to like really acknowledge that it's undeniable that the Jewish population in the Middle East, and in fact the world, of course, is tiny. There are about 7 million Jews in Israel and about 15 million worldwide. And again, let's not discount the fact that anti-Semitic genocides, massacres, pogroms throughout the millennia have meant generations upon generations of lost Jewish lives. There are 23 official Muslim states, 21 Christian states. Just because the Jewish people are small in number does not mean that we do not deserve a state as well. And we're talking about one of the world's tiniest states. Not like, honestly, why is the world so obsessed with Israel and branding it as the only illegitimate country on Earth?
Ultimately, there's no escaping the role that the Jews play in the imagination of two major civilizations. All the civilizations that are in one way or another based on some form of Christianity, from the Russian to European to Western, and of course the Islamic. Generally China, Japan, before they came in contact with Russian anti-Semitism, or, India before it came into contact with British ideas, they don't have an obsession, because Jews literally don't play a role in their concept of themselves as a civilization. But Jews play an insanely outsized role in the imagination of Christianity and all the civilizations that it has brought forth, Eastern, Western, and of course Islam. And when you think about it, Zionism is not just a movement for self-determination, for liberation. I mean, that's what the movement is about. But at the core, what it does is that it challenges deeply held civilizational worldviews about the fact that it is the destiny of the Jews to be dispossessed, stateless, weak. Each civilization has its own version, but generally, except for the 17th century Christian restorationism, 17th century, what is today known as Christian Zionism, except for that branch of Christianity, all other branches of Christianity and of Islam essentially cannot accept the idea of Jews with a backbone. And what Zionism basically does is say, we have a backbone. We're going to be sovereign. We're going to defend ourselves by ourselves. We're going to be equal. Not more, not less, just equal. Uh, and even that idea is too much. The idea that the Jews are both collectively and individually equal, when so many civilizations have been built on the idea that they are supersede the Jews, that the Jews are their inferiors. Sometimes to explain the conflict from the Arab and Islamic perspective, there's this reigning mythology, Jews and Arabs lived in harmony in Arab and Muslim lands until the birth of Zionism. And I said they lived in harmony as long as the Jews knew their inferior place. So there was a very clear hierarchy. And I always like to bring two examples of how that hierarchy was maintained. It was maintained in a variety of ways. But my two favorite is the Jews could not ride horses. Horses were a mark of dignity. They could only ride donkeys in Arab and Muslim lands. And they could, of course, not carry weapons because they were of what was an inferior demi statute, kind of basically they were supposed to be humiliated until they understand that while they got the first book right, it's time to move along and, accept the sequels, especially the third one. But in that interim era, until Jews become Muslims, they were supposed to be clearly inferior and understand their inferiority. So one was they could not, and they could not protect themselves, right? Because that was against the idea of their inferiority. Now you look at the early images of the early Zionists in the late 19th and 20th century. What do you see immediately? You see Jews in the land of Israel doing two things, riding horses and bearing arms. Imagine the civilizational shock of what that means.
And now and now it's what, F-16 fighter jets. I mean, and
It actually doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. That's the thing.
well,
It's all part of the same thing. It's all
sure,
part of like, how dare you defend yourself?
exactly.
That's against nature.
Right, right. I'm just saying that we've moved so
I
far
know, I'm joking. Yeah.
beyond the unarmed horseman, donkey man. Now, yeah. So now Israel has this absolute regional power, and I would argue are a global superpower, though for reasons I can't understand, people are so reluctant to admit that. But so basically, if I were to boil this down to a sentence, would you say it's just people do not like a powerful Jew?
Like makes it very personal, and I think one of the problems often is people don't understand that it's not personal. It's not about what their feelings are. People are part of cultures and civilizations that determine a lot of the patterns of our thinking. And to be born into civilizations that have weaved into them uh, an obsession with the role of the Jew is is to be already predetermined to think in a certain way, even if you don't realize that. So it's not about your personal likes or dislikes for anyone. It's about living in civilizations that have a very deep substrate of an obsession with the role of the Jew and a need for that Jew to not be actually powerful. They could be imaginary powerful, right? Imaginary controlling world, imaginary Christ killers, that they can do. But to wield actual power, which means they are therefore capable of self-defense, capable of not being at the mercy of others, that's a problem.
And really quickly, we're closing in on an hour. Can we continue this conversation? Because we haven't even got into the two-state solution yet.
We kind of got into it multiple times, but sure, about 10 more minutes I can do.
Oh, okay. So let me talk about so going back to the concept of illegitimate states, right? Right now, 149 UN member states recognize Palestine as a sovereign state. This is despite the fact that so-called Palestine has no actual borders or government, which are two absolute requisites for statehood. On top of that, UNRWA designates the Palestinian people as eternal refugees, and you can't be a refugee in your own country. So it turns out that double standards against the state of Israel also translate into ludicrous double standards in favor of an imaginary Palestinian state. What worries me is in June 2025, next year, the UN is having a summit on the two-state solution, and the vote is already a foregone conclusion. What does officially recognizing a Palestinian state mean for both Israel and the Palestinian people?
So let's start with the whole notion of Palestinian statehood in the international system. I call it Schrodinger's Palestine or Schrodinger's Palestinian state because does Palestine exist as a state for the purpose of making life miserable for Israel and international institutions? Absolutely, yes. So you have, again, I'm not a legal scholar, but you have bizarre legal kind of jumping through hoops to claim that Palestine is a state in order to prosecute Israelis at the ICC. So using Palestine as a state in order to go against Israel and international institutions, absolutely. Then Palestine is a state. Then the cat is alive. But is Palestine a state for the, like you mentioned, for assumption of responsibility, for example, for invading Israel on October 7th? Is Palestine a state for assuming responsibility for everyone being born in Palestine, not being a bizarrely Palestine refugee? Then no, then the cat is dead. Then the state of Palestine magically doesn't exist. So having another vote in the UN merely accentuates this Schrodinger's Palestine. Like, yes, it will continue to exist as a means of kind of prosecuting and persecuting Israel and international bodies, but it will not exist for any notion of assuming responsibility.
So you don't think that they will determine borders and say, because Israel is the only country on earth that is asked to give up territory that it won, not only in a war, but in a defensive war, you don't think they're going to say, we're going back to 67 borders and this is what the world is going to recognize?
No, absolutely. Again, I'll make it clear.
Yeah.
They will never accept the idea that Palestine is only a state limited to the previously Jordanian-controlled West Bank or the Egyptian-controlled Gaza Strip, and therefore should treat the people who live there as no longer refugees or therefore not possessing any notion of a right to settle inside Israel. So if you were to be logical and standardized, and the UN would say, look, we really want to promote a two-state solution, and the way and one is Jewish, remember, then we're going to make it clear. We're going to recognize Palestine and the West Bank and Gaza. We're also going to make it clear that anyone living in that Palestine, born in it, is not a Palestine refugee, because that would be weird. And they have no bizarre claim to settle in another fellow sovereign state in the name of return. If the UN were to say all that, I would be both impressed and I would say, okay, this really means that they're trying to really push a two-state solution when one of them is the Jewish state. But that's not what they're doing. So what they're doing is, again, playing with this Schrodinger's Palestine. They will recognize Palestine enough to not endanger all the infrastructure that is used to undermine Israel, which is the whole perpetual Palestinian refugeehood, this claim of return. They will never recognize a Palestine in a way that undermines those claims. And that's Schrodinger's Palestine for you. I can assure you the UN will do nothing to determine really whether the cat is dead or alive.
Interesting. The eternal struggle. And as long as UNRWA exists, this will persist. But boy, there's so many topics to go into. Einat, have you ever heard of the new state solution?
I've heard various versions of it, yes.
Okay, so I just want to pass this by you because it's honestly, for me, it's the most interesting solution that I've heard. Though it assumes falsely that what the Palestinians actually want is just a state on their own. But let's forget about that part. Let's pretend that their goal is just to have a state. So basically, the new state solution would create one contiguous state that includes Gaza, plus a large part of the Sinai. Egypt would give up that land, and it's mostly barren anyway, and they gain like the regional like relevance and recognition that they so deeply crave for doing so. Egypt really wants to be like a player in the region, so this is a win for them. In exchange,
So if I may stop you here, because there's about, for the last few years, I get in my mailbox about every other day another solution.
yeah,
What they all have in common, and you said it yourself, and I think you could have stopped after you said that, they all make an assumption that the Arabs that currently go by the name Palestinians want a sovereign state anywhere. Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, part of Egypt, doesn't matter. It makes a false assumption, but the assumption is not true. So first, the Arabs who live in this land have to stop being Palestinianists. They have to first stop obsessing over the destruction of the Jewish state. Any solution that allows a Jewish state to live is one that, from the Palestinianist perspective, is no solution. So it's really nice that you think it's a good idea, but the false assumption is they do not want a state if that means that there is a Jewish state. So the only way to get to any kind of agreement, solution, peace is for the Palestinians to stop being Palestinianists, to stop obsessing over the non-existence of the Jewish state. Once they stop that, a whole array of solutions is found. They can join with Jordan, with Egypt. They can have their own state. They can everything. But if you don't address the core issue, everything else doesn't matter.
so I guess that brings us back, not back, we haven't discussed it yet. The question that people have been asking since October 7th or 8th is, can you kill an ideology? Obviously, we saw for all intents and purposes that the Allies did destroy Nazism, but that required removal of the entire Third Reich. And I don't know, maybe under Trump, I don't know that the world has the chutzpah to first, we got to start, of course, with Iran, but thoughts are thoughts. And we're talking about a population that's so radicalized that ultimately, even when we talk about these multiple state solutions, Jordan and Egypt don't want them. Like, they do not want them for the same reason that the Jews cannot absorb them, like to take in, never mind that one Jewish state would mean taking in 5 million Palestinians, which would equalize the numbers in the population, thereby destroying the Jewish state by fact of democracy. But you would also be absorbing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Islamist radicals into your borders as citizens. And this is why it confounds me when the far right, Smotrich, Ben Gvir are like, oh, we need one Jewish state. It's like, Really? Because all they have to do then is have more babies than we do, and all of a sudden there is no more Jewish state. And the radicals flood in, exactly what we're seeing in Europe, in America, in Australia, across the world, and it is destroying Western civilization.
So I'll take it from a different direction. As long as the Jews want to be sovereign, there is only one land in the world where they can be sovereign. Sometimes people ask me over the years, why here? Why not somewhere else? I'm like, anywhere else is exile. Again, we can live in other places, but sovereignty is only in the land of Israel. It's the only place where we make sense as a people. It's the only place where we can have the presence of a people who are at home. Now, as long as we want to be sovereign, there's only one piece of land where it makes sense. Again, it doesn't have to be every square inch, but kind of generally in that area. That means that we are destined or damned, choose your word, to remain a Jewish, tiny ethnic, linguistic, religious, national minority in an overwhelming Arab and Muslim Middle East. The Arab and Islamic conquests of North Africa and the region were huge successes, so well done to them. But that means that as long as the Jews want to be sovereign, they will have to do so, surrounded by hundreds of millions of Arabs and now 2 billion Muslims, which means that ultimately the only path to peace has to go. It doesn't go through drawing borders and maps and putting the state here or there or that or that. The only real path to peace is something that I've come to call over the years Arab Zionism. It basically means the Arab and Muslim acceptance of the Jewish right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland and viewing that not as a source of Arab shame, as many do now, but rather, as I think it should be, a source of Arab pride. That it is they who basically have in their midst a Jewish state. So that is what has to happen. So we can play all we want with maps, but we have to ultimately address the core issue. The Arab, Islamic, unfortunately supported by many in the West, obsession with Jews with a backbone. When they finally decide to not be obsessed with that, because ultimately this obsession is the mark of unhealthy societies. So I think it is also a process for them to stop being unhealthy societies that are obsessed with putting Jews back in their so-called proper place. When you address that, then you can, figure it and draw borders and do that. But that's the only vision that makes any difference. That's my view.
Sure. And let me just point out the hypocrisy and double standards in people saying, why can't the Jews just go to Africa or Alaska or whatever, name the place, New York? Why aren't people asking the same question about, well, why can't the Palestinians go somewhere else? Like, it's so funny that the double standards are so pervasive and people are so blind to them that every argument turns once and again against the Jewish people, wherein the arguments apply just as much, if not, I would argue more so, but of course I'm biased, to the Arabs and the Palestinians. I need to, don't want to, need to respect your time. So let me just ask you before we close off, and by the way, I'm going to include a link to that article by Shani into the show notes. But I know that these discussions, especially in the post 10/7 era, tend to take us down a pretty dark road in there's a lot of darkness on this road, but as a nation of Israel, right, we were built on Hatikva, on the hope. Einat, in your opinion, where is the hope? Short game or long game? Where's the hope?
By the way, and that also has to do with the hope. I was recently in Canada, and I was told in Canada they do land acknowledgement by speaking of the land as being the traditional and unceded territory of a particular people. Unceded meaning that those people never willingly gave it to anyone else. And I discussed Israel as being the traditional and unceded territory of Am Yisrael. When people look at land acknowledgement, no one asks why everyone acknowledges that a people were connected to a particular land. And this is the Jewish people. They're connected to a particular land. We're about to celebrate Hanukkah. I sometimes feel a sense of, I don't know, bizarre sadness looking at these so-called Jewish, but they're not really Jewish organizations that try to celebrate Jewish holidays without Zionism, but they contort themselves into pretzels because the connection of the people of Israel with the land of Israel is so woven into the tribe of Israel that you can't celebrate the Hebrew calendar without acknowledging the traditional and unceded territory. So the hope for me is because we are home and because we are on our traditional and unceded territory, I believe that however long it takes, ultimately the hope is found in Arabs and Muslims acknowledging that the Jews are not foreign European, white colonialists, blah, blah, blah. Those are all essentially synonyms to say foreign, so go away. But that we are actually a people home. And that's where I find hope.
Amen to that. Einat, it's been such a pleasure and an honor to be able to speak with you. Thank you so much for
Thank
taking
you.
time. And if I could leave with just 3 words, Am Yisrael Chai.
Certainly, even though many try to make it not so.
We will live forever.